the important elements of research and analysis with advocacy, outreach, and communications. So how do advocacy-based approaches factor into your work?
So again, great question. And I've had meetings all morning where we've been talking about this. In our sector, we've gotten away for a long time with not showing evidence, not even showing any unintended consequences, seeing that if this program worked, but did it have any impact overall? And again, that's changing. And there are some organizations that are doing a great job looking at this and making sure that this evidence comes into play. But we have to do better, and we have to do a lot better. So we have to publicize when we learn something. It's hard to do a lot of times because, again, a lot of programs aren't doing it. They're doing a lot of focus on outputs. That's what the donor wants. We spent the money the way we said we were going to spend it, but they don't say, this is the impact that we had. These are the unintended consequences that we had. So I think that's a big problem. There's a competition. There's not a lot of funding in this field. So any really good learnings are kept because it's a competitive advantage. And then also you are working in conflict affected and fragile states. I was running a conflict governance program in Ethiopia for 4 years. And the government, we weren't supposed to be running that program. So the government, anything that went out, the government would look at. So we did not release a lot of our reports. They went to the donor, but they didn't go farther than that. But there are ways that we can sanitize that information and be able to get it out, even if you're working in a very restricted environment. So there's some things on us that we need to do as a field in terms of the evidence piece. So those are the problems with our evidence base. How do we then get the evidence into advocacy? And why is it important? Because one, people on the Hill have told us, Congress, if you can't prove it, why are we funding this? How do we know what's working and what isn't working? People just keep proposing some of the same programs over and over again. We have no evidence to say they worked or not. So one of the things AFP has done is, let's say we've looked at countering violent extremism, that subsector, and go down in that. People have theories of change that they treat as gospel. And some of them have even been put out by the U.S. government in the peacebuilding sector. So we've looked at them. Do we even have evidence on this theory of change? Does it work? Does it not work? And what more do we need to know? So we are systematically going through a lot of subsector reviews, working with our different partners to say, please stop just throwing this theory of change out there, even if it's on some government list somewhere. Make sure that you do the literature review. Make sure that you know what's out there, what isn't out there. And then once you do good work, we need to publicize it, and we need to understand how do we put that back into a package that can be put into a policy document that's no more than 2 pages, because nobody reads in Washington more than 2 pages. And make sure your recommendations are clear and concise. And even if you said, okay, this didn't work. Okay, but what is the next theory? Okay, if this didn't work, why don't we, then look at this? One of the examples I was talking about earlier today was we have some anecdotal evidence that on trauma and mental health in this field, that if you attach some psychosocial programming to other programs that are running, that actually might be more helpful. So people think, they're coming in for this, but they're actually getting a little bit more here. So we have some anecdotal information that from people who have received that programming that has been helpful. Okay. And we've heard about it in other places. So let's test that theory. But don't just assume that it works, but test it and say, hey, we have this theory. But what happens a lot of times is that people then just go off and do it and start treating it as gospel.
So going back to the GFA, you had talked about how many different sectors have to intersect in terms of, actually putting the legislation together. But I'm curious as to how you see the potential of the GFA in touching other parts of society around the world beyond just maybe countering violent extremism, which of course is, the main kind of crux of this legislation, but parts of society and development like health system strengthening, migration, gender equality. It seems like the GFA can really have a huge impact on all of these different pieces. So how hopeful are you that this legislation can actually do that?
So 2 points. A couple of points. I could talk all day about this, but just to go back really quickly on what you were talking about in terms of prevention, and I don't think I answered that question completely. Why the GFA is so important is because it really is, for the first time, we're talking about prevention and peace building. And I think that is the critical piece of it. Now, it says 5 countries or regions, 2 at least have to be prevention countries. And that was something that in the end, when we knew it was going to come on the appropriations bill, that we really wanted to hold the line on, because we wanted to see this work in prevention countries, and more than one, because we wanted to have a bit of a cross sector. So that's really, I think, one of the key pieces of the GFA. On the second side, and what's so key about that is because it is really hard to get donors and the international community to focus on a prevention country, because when things are blowing up all over the world, where does your attention go? Coupled with the fact of how do you get people to pay attention? When there's so much violent conflict, and how do you decide where those resources go? And so that I by far think is one of the most important aspects of it. On the issue of bringing in other sectors, this will not work if you don't. So again, I go back to Bangladesh as an example. You have the bulk of the funding that's going in there, education, health, agriculture. If those programs are not part of this design and are not focusing on their work from a conflict-sensitive approach, and that is beyond do no harm. The first thing we want to make sure no program is doing harm. But it's got to be more than that. And it's got to say, okay, first, do no harm. Secondly, how is this sector, program, activity helping to reduce violence and build sustainable peace? And I will say this, and the education sector has done a lot of work in this area, but it is hard to crack a lot of these other development sectors. And health has been one of the hardest ones. And so I think what you just saw happen in DRC not too long ago with the Ebola clinics, there was a lot of mistrust around them, the health clinics. Violence was sparked. Some were burnt down. It is a good time to talk to the health sector, and we've started to say, okay, one, how do we do no harm? Clearly, harm was done there. But this was an opportunity to help reduce violence and build sustainable peace. And you have to be better at it, and you have to be working in that space. You can't just say we're saving lives and we don't have time, because that argument doesn't work anymore, coupled with the fact that you're missing a huge opportunity to help in terms of building sustainable peace. So that's just an example. But at the same time, the field has to compromise. We have to use the language that they're using. If they don't want to talk about conflict because they want to be more neutral, okay, so let's talk about risk then. we have to also simplify this conflict sensitivity so that you don't need a PhD to understand it. We have to help and give them the resources and the technical expertise to build it in a practical way, but they also have to be open to it and understand their role in this conflict dynamic.
So as you look forward towards the rest of the year and also the coming couple of years, what are some conflicts that you're keeping an eye on? Are there any countries or regions that you think are being overlooked as potential hotspots for conflict?
Again, this is just such a hard question because there are so many out there. If you look on one of my favorite sites is the Fund for Peace conflict, the Fragile State Index. You'll see a lot of countries sitting in the warning site. Ethiopia, again, is another example. I mean, it hovers. It's always hovered in the last even probably 2 decades around number 19 or 20. But you also have to go in and see, okay, the conflict dynamics, those indicators are flashing, but what's the flip side? What's holding it back? What's the resiliency side of it there? And so that, I think, is, it's a bit more complicated than just going in and looking at the grievances and the conflict dynamics that are very targeted into what's wrong. So in that regard, you have to look at it as more of a holistic approach. And I think we forget to do that a lot of times. And then also one more aspect of it is that what sparks it? Something's got to really spark it. And, I don't think anybody predicted what happened with the Arab Spring. If you go down into Tunisia, what was the cause? It was somebody who got fed up and tired. He was told to move his stall, his livelihood. And that was a major spark. So it is hard to, I always say it's not an exact science. And it just isn't, because you're dealing with also human beings that can be very irrational. And they don't do what you think they're going to do. That being said, we have some good examples of, if you look at Burkina Faso right now, 2 years ago, we had great indicators that there were serious problems in Burkina Faso. And we didn't focus on conflict prevention there. We are now, but the problem is Burkina Faso, the government has lost swaths of areas where they have no control. It isn't just violent extremism. You have a security problem with many different issues in terms of splinter groups, some of it criminal. So what do you do now with Burkina Faso? So I have people coming up to me all the time. One that somebody came up to me after I was talking about Burkina Faso at a State Department conference, came up and said, "You just described what's happening in Cameroon right now." Ethiopia is a perfect example again. Everybody is so excited about this political reform. We just put out a report that says, you're having great political reforms, and these are the challenges. And, this is, again, the Fund for Peace in 2020 will most likely say it's one of the worsened states in terms of conflict dynamics. But you had this great political reform. In order to get into, the Fund for Peace side or any other conflict watch list and take those, top 20 countries and go in, but then also looking at, what is that resiliency factor? And, a good way to look at it also, elections. We know elections are a big spark for violence. And again, Ethiopia right now keeps postponing its elections, but right now they're set for August. So those are some of the things that looking at. And I will tell you one thing that I am incredibly nervous about is Afghanistan right now. I think it's pretty clear what the U.S. government wants to do there, namely get out. And I can't imagine what it would be like to be in Afghanistan now for the last almost 20 years, staying there or going back there, and recognizing that this all will be coming to an end soon with an agreement that isn't, in the past or in the recent past, has not been inclusive, with safeguards and monitoring set up in terms of any agreement that is decided with the Taliban.
Well, thank you, Liz, so much for your time and for your